Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the G20 Summit. I'm Wang Mengmang in Beijing. Leaders from G20 members, guest countries, and international organizations have gathered in East China's Hangzhou city to discuss how to enhance international economic cooperation. This two-day event will soon draw to a close, and later in the afternoon, President Xi Jinping will speak at a press conference to share the achievements made during the meetings. And we'll be going live to Hangzhou, where the event is taking place. And here in our Beijing studio, we're joined by Mr. Liu Youfa. He's former vice president of the China Institute of International Studies, and John Ross. He's the managing director of Northhead, a strategic communication firm. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program.
You're welcome.
And now let's get the latest from our reporter Su Yuting. She's joining us live from the host city Hangzhou for what we'll be looking at this afternoon. Well, Yuting, it's great to have you with us. So we understand that President Xi Jinping will be making a speech. Tell us what we can expect there.
Yes, Mama, you know that today's press conference is scheduled to take place around 5:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and that's about several minutes to go. And as you can see behind me, over there, that podium, President Xi Jinping will stage on that podium and meet nearly about 600 journalists from all across the world here. And as you know that reporters are very looking forward to the joint communique that China will deliver, and they are looking forward to what concrete measures that China will take to boost the economic global growth. And as you can see that China's goal is to working together with other G20 members to boost the innovative, interconnected, invigorated and inclusive world economy. And one of the very most important words for President Xi Jinping to mention is about development. As the largest developing country, China always attaches great importance to development. And this time, President Xi Jinping will just cooperate with other G20 members and urge all parties to take concrete efforts to make the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development. And another key word for President Xi Jinping, whether he will about to mention, is about innovation. Because you know that the sluggish world economy recovery just indicates that the traditional QE policies and fiscal policies are no longer sustainable, and they cannot solve the fundamental long-term structural problems. So right now, we need new innovative policies to boost the world economy. And China has already initiated the Belt and Road Initiative and also about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to make more communication and connectivity among the G20 members. So let's wait and see what will be the details that President Xi Jinping will deliver during his speech.
Well, exactly, Yuting. President Xi Jinping's previous speeches at the G20 Summit were full of confidence, which provided the much-needed assurance for the world economy, which is undergoing some sluggish recovery. Also, you've been talking to different media, people from different media outlets. What has been the response from the international media?
Yes, Maman, as you said, that international community and international media pay great attention to the Hangzhou Summit, G20 Summit this time. And I'd like to highlight is the very important thing is that as for the developing countries, this time, there is the number of the developing countries invited to the G20 summit this time is larger than any previous summit. So this indicates that the G20 will make a more greater role in the economic global governance. And China will also to implement more actions, because earlier I've spoke to a senior official from the foreign ministry. He told me that during this G20 summit, China will just make nearly about 30 outcomes that will make this year's summit one of the most fruitful ones. And you know that developed and developing countries could sit together to discuss the international affairs through consultation on the equal footing. That represents the peoples were just coming together to discuss these questions together. And for more on that, we're now joined by a guest. He's from Malawi, the reporter of Kingsley. So Kingsley, you have been waiting here for a long time for President Xi's speech. Could you please tell us what's your expectation for President Xi's speech, and what are the major issues that you are most interested in?
First, I have to congratulate China for hosting a successful G20 summit. And yeah, from developing country, I expect the president to emphasize or to re-emphasize on inclusive growth. You know, the developing countries have been left out for some time, but we've seen China pushing the interest of these countries, and this has benefited the developing countries so much. So I expect the re-emphasizing on that point. If you look at the previous speeches by the president, he has also mentioned about not only inclusive growth but also poverty reduction. You know, the number of poor people in developing countries continue to increase, and it's because of the development that is not impacting on them. So we saw the mention of that, and I'm sure he's going to emphasize on that point again as he's making his final address.
Okay, thank you very much, Kingsley. Well, Mang, as just this reporter from Malawi mentioned about, is the inclusive and also representative of this Hangzhou G20 Summit. And this is historical because, you know, that this just represents all the developed countries and developing countries' ideas. And most important one is that the developing countries' voice can be clearly heard during this G20 Summit. So let's take a look at what President Xi Jinping will deliver his speech and what we are going to hear about his speech. So back to you, Mang, in the studio.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Yuting, for bringing us up to date from Hangzhou. As this G20 summit concludes, leaders have vowed to strengthen coordination to foster global economic recovery. From the bilateral meetings on the sidelines, which made headlines, to the impressive historical beauty of the whole city of Hangzhou, CCTV's Han Peng has a brief wrap-up of the event from the city.
The spectacular opening gala of the G20 Summit in Hangzhou may have impressed the world, but when it comes down to serious business, world leaders still face daunting challenges. The world's recovery remains weak after the 2008 financial crisis, with the global jobless rate almost reaching 6%.
8 years ago, G20 was entrusted with a mission to pull the world economy back from collapse at a difficult time of financial crisis. That mission was achieved with the spirit of mutual help and partnership. Today, the global economy once again comes to a critical juncture, with huge challenges ahead.
Chinese President Xi Jinping urged the G20 members to resist protectionism and foster innovation to boost growth. He said the global economy can hardly recover without open trade and coordinated macroeconomic policies among the G20 members.
After I have heard of his speech, I feel that China has changed a lot. I just feel that China cannot work alone. We have to work with other economy. That's why he mentioned about the interconnectivity and also the inclusiveness.
And China will be persistent on reform. And he even used the word, it says, 壮士断腕, which means, you know, a person, a warrior, even want to risk cutting his own wrist to push forward for one goal.
It's a great success that China is hosting the G20. When Canada was very involved in creating the G20 back in the 1990s, one of the reasons for the fact that we needed a G20 and not just a G7 and others was because we had to have China involved in the discussions around the global economy.
I think China has confidence in its economy. It's a great role model for Brazil and other countries facing an economic recovery. The G20 Hangzhou Summit presented great opportunities for others to learn from China.
Outside the summit, some notable meetings also grabbed headlines. President Xi met with his U.S. counterpart Barack Obama. Disagreements remain on thorny issues like the South China Sea, but one widely appreciated consensus was their climate change agreement.
Another achievement of this year's summit is the promotion of Hangzhou. The second-tier city was not really as famous or developed as big cities like Beijing or Shanghai, but through its impressive opening gala on its West Lake, as well as beautiful skylines of its new high-rises, the city is now gaining a much bigger global exposure and influence. Han Peng, CCTV, from G20 Summit in Hangzhou.
And Chinese President Xi Jinping also delivered a speech at the opening of the G20 Summit, which drew close media attention worldwide. Our Wang Tongxuan has more on this.
A report by BBC says China's President Xi Jinping has urged leaders of the world's 20 largest economies to avoid empty talk as they look to quicken economic growth. The report notes President Xi said the global economy was at a crucial juncture due to volatile markets and feeble trade. Japan's NHK reports President Xi Jinping shows China's close attention to the developing countries in his opening speech. The report quotes a speech saying that the G20 should listen to the voices of the world nations, especially the developing countries, to make their work more inclusive. Canada's largest TV station CBC reports President Xi calls for the liberalization and facilitation of trade and investment. It says Canada has also high expectations of China's market of huge growth and potential. The Washington Post reports China's hosting of two-day summit is seen as part of its drive to cement its place among global economic leaders. And Middle Eastern media have also focused on the summit. On Saturday, the UAE's Khaleej Times reported that the summit is greatly significant to the current global political and economic situation.
And now let's go live to Hangzhou and let's turn to our Mike Water there. He's live with us in our Hangzhou studio by the West Lake. Well, Mike, you and our crew there have been busy bringing us news and views from Hangzhou over the past 10 days. What have you got for us now?
Well, Mong, as you know, leaders from the G20 nations, guest countries as well as international organizations, all are sharing their thoughts on this year's summit. Let's hear what they have to say about this year's summit and their suggestions on how to revive a sluggish economy.
I hope the G20 Summit will find a solution to address both the symptom and the root causes of the global economic problems and achieve strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive economic growth.
Sustainable development requires sustainable peace. For the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to succeed, for a steady economic growth to be achieved, we need peace and development to work hand in hand.
This meeting is an opportunity for China to show the responsibility that comes with greater economic power.
We established another core theme, and given that past summits heavily focus on fiscal and monetary policy resulting in expansive actions in that field, I think it is right that the Chinese presidency now focuses on structural reforms in different areas.
G20 in Hangzhou, it's a very great opportunity in a strong moment of the international life of community. We have a lot of problems around the world, not only in the economic field, for the growth or for the inequality.
It's a great success that China is hosting the G20. When Canada was very involved in creating the G20 back in the 1990s, one of the reasons for the fact that we needed a G20 and not just a G7 and others was because we had to have China involved in the discussions around the global economy.
I think China has confidence in its economy. It's a great role model for Brazil and other countries facing an economic recovery. The G20 Hangzhou Summit presented great opportunities for others to learn from China. More countries want to be involved in the G20 platform. As developing countries, we should work together for common prosperity.
Leaders at the G20 Summit have been discussing innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive ways towards economic development. That's, of course, the theme of this year's event. So why do they matter, and what have been some of the other buzzwords at this year's meeting? CCTV's Wang Tongxuan has more.
Let's begin with the Smart Innovation Initiative. It's a concept proposed by the B20 group to encourage greater innovation and entrepreneurship. It stands for Sustainable Innovation, Massive Public Platform, Accessible Network, Revolutionary Reform, and Technological Innovation. Business representatives hope to find ways to fund more infrastructure investment by encouraging development banks to enable private sector investment. They also see great potential in green finance and digital technology. Capital support into environmentally friendly sectors is one aspect of green finance. It's been included on the G20 agenda for the first time to mobilize greater cash inflow into environmentally friendly projects and build international consensus around green finance. Moving to the theme of this year's summit, leaders have been discussing innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive ways towards economic development. Well, we can view those four key buzzwords as a direction of G20 members want to see the world economy heading in, but they can also be interpreted as the problems that we are facing, as the global economy is somewhat lacking when it comes to those four key points. Since the financial crisis, global annual trade growth slowed from 7% in 2008 to just 3% last year. The U.S. is arguably the only member of G20 that can claim to have had a decent economic recovery, with annual GDP growth of between 2 and 3% and unemployment down to 5%. Meanwhile, the Eurozone had been mired in debt problems. Economic woes are also mounting in emerging markets as commodity prices tumble. So the current circumstances make it hard to claim that the world economy has been invigorated. And this explains why the G20 is calling on innovation as a catalyst to encourage stimulus. For interconnectivity and inclusivity, this comes to a wake of the rising protectionism and the stagnated reform process of global governance. The World Trade Organization reported that G20 markets imposed a record 145 new trade restrictive measures in the first 7 months of 2016, the highest number since 2009. Many believe global governance can no longer be dominated by advanced economies, but must also include more developing countries. That's why this year's G20 has seen more representatives from emerging economies invited to attend the event than ever before. Wang Longxuan, CCTV.
It's been fascinating to watch. That's it from our studios here on the West Lake. Wang, back to you in the studio.
Well, Mike, I'd like to ask you this before we let you go. You've been in Hangzhou for a while now. What's it like to cover the G20 summit from where it's all happening?
You know, it's been fascinating for me because, as you mentioned, I've been here for a while. I got here actually before the B20 even began, so I can remember going out to the International Media Center, this pristine, very large facility, as reporters were just beginning to trickle in, and then I went a day later, and what a difference a day makes. It was just flooded with journalists, and as you know, we've got thousands of them here. And then there's the surrealistic quality. One day I went out for a walk around the West Lake. As I was heading over there, here came Ban Ki-moon's motorcade by me, and then after I was done with the lengthy walk, he was going in the other direction. It's not often you see the head of the UN driving around in Hangzhou, and I saw it twice in one day, so that was pretty remarkable.
And Mark, you've been following Marco Polo's footsteps in Hangzhou. You visited local markets, ate traditional delicacies, and even experienced quite a bit of Chinese hospitality. So what will you remember the most from Hangzhou?
Boy, that's a tough one. I think this lake, obviously, is just a gorgeous place, and we work in a rather stressful environment, so it's really nice to just kind of go outside and decompress. You can walk around it. It's just beautiful, gorgeous. And then, of course, last night's show. I mean, what a remarkable, almost mind-blowing presentation, and I'm sure the world leaders will remember it for some time to come as they head back to their respective countries.
Well, definitely an unforgettable spectacle. Thank you so much, Mike, for bringing us up to date from Hangzhou, and thank you, our CCTV crew there, who's been covering the G20 summit for us there. And now let's talk some more serious issues, and we're joined in the studio by Mr. Liu Youfa, former Vice President of China Institute of International Studies, and Mr. John Russell, Managing Director of the North Head. Welcome, gentlemen, to our show. So this, of course, is the first G20 summit being held in China. So how do you think the summit has fared so far over the past 3 days? What was the major achievement that stood out most to you? Let me begin with you, Mr. Liu.
First of all, the G20 has put the issue of development for all the previous 10 summits. You know, the monetary policy, fiscal policies were the main issues. Now, we have the inclusive development as the major issue. And secondly, the kind of inclusive growth and the liberalization of trade and investment and Number 4, if I may add, the institutional buildings of the G20s, which will help to convert G20 as a talk shop into an action platform. So these are the achievements. But let me just conclude. All the participants came with all the expectations and questions. Now they basically have reached the broad consensus on the issue of crisis prevention and management, the common development, and also the building up the system of governance.
Well, a lot has been said about the 4 I's, the theme of this year's G20 Summit, and while we wait for this final announcement of the communique, which will mark the end of this year's G20 Summit and also a summary of what's been done over the past 3 years, Mr. Rosso, how do you understand these 4 I's? Which of these 4 I's stand out most to you, and how do you make sense of it?
I would put innovation as the key one, because in many ways the others flow from it logically. I see the value. You asked what was the outcomes. I think one of the fundamental outcomes, it's reoriented and reconfigured the G20 from being just a crisis management and a very financially driven, financial architecture driven, to bring in many more dimensions to open up growth. Technology, digital innovation, to involve also the restructuring of economies, and particularly to low carbon economies with the environmental area, and to, as Dr. Leo raised, the development agenda. Not only from a development as a good thing to do, but as a driver of growth. So moving from crisis management to a roadmap for growth moving forward.
But it's not a difficult task to move from a crisis response mechanism to a platform that can allow countries to have a better say in global economic governance. Gentlemen, we're going to get back to that later on in the show. But let's turn to this now. This year's G20 has been a summit of firsts, being China's first time to host a G20 summit. The theme of, as we mentioned, innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive has shown that China's G20 presidency has been one of great ambition. Our Ding Siyue tells us more.
This year's G20 summit has a record number of developing countries attending. Apart from G20 members and international organizations, China also invited 8 guest countries, including major developing nations like Egypt and Kazakhstan. This also reflects China's efforts to focus on development issues during the summit. And for the first time, the G20 summit aims to have a blueprint for long-term global economic growth. China has set developing a blueprint for innovative growth as this year's major topic. The blueprint will find a new and strong impetus for world economic growth and will set a series of concrete action plans in various areas including innovation, new industrial revolution, and digital economy. The first G20 trade ministers meeting was also held in July under China's presidency. Trade protectionism has been an obstacle for multilateral trade and investment. China hopes that G20 members will reiterate their opposition to protectionist policy and achieve smooth economic dialogue and shared development objectives during the summit. This year marks the first year of implementing the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The G20 Hangzhou Summit will strive for formulate action plans to implement the agenda. Meanwhile, the summit may well turn out to be one of the most fruitful summits ever, as nearly 30 positive outcomes are expected to come from the meeting. Ding Siyue, CCTV.
Secretary General of the United Nations Ban Ki-moon has hailed China's presidency of the G20 summit, praising in particular its invitation to a record number of developing countries to join this year's meeting. While the Secretary General faced media ahead of the opening of the summit in Hangzhou, and CCTV's Xia Ruixue reports.
It's the last G20 summit Ban Ki-moon is attending as UN Secretary General, but there is no sadness in his eyes when he faced the press on Sunday morning. That's because before the summit, he received the instruments for joining the Paris Agreement by China and the US.
The actions taken by early ratifiers like China and United States, those are two biggest emitters. I think these are far-reaching, visionary. They are working for the people. They are working for the planet Earth. The Sustainable Development Goals and climate change are tightly interlinked.
This year, a record number of developing countries are participating in the G20 Summit for the first time in its history. The summit will focus on sustainable development, especially in developing countries, including those from Africa.
I highly commend, and I'm very happy that the G20, for the first time in the history of G20, that Hangzhou Joint Communique is now focusing on this Sustainable Development Action Agenda as one of their most important outcome documents.
Ban Ki-moon expressed his appreciation for the Chinese presidency for this year's G20 Summit and says he looks forward to the summit's final joint communique. Ban Ki-moon praised China has far-reaching and compassionate vision to invite these developing countries because it's always easy to say to help promote sustainable development with the developing countries, but it's more difficult to take actions. 夏瑞雪 CCTV 杭州 Zhejiang Province.
Meanwhile, CCTV also spoke to leaders from some international organizations attending this year's event about their thoughts on the Hangzhou Summit.
I just came from meeting with the finance ministers, and for the finance ministers to have these opportunities to share with each other what they're seeing, what they're trying to accomplish, and then coming out of these meetings with a message that we're focused, we're talking to each other, we're doing all the things that we need to do to build greater resilience into the global economy. We're using all measures, monetary, fiscal, structural policies in order to get the world back on a path of stronger growth. But also I think for the leaders, just getting together and saying we need to build resilience into the entire global system. We embrace trade, for example. There are a lot of voices that are very strongly against trade, but we at the World Bank Group, and I think all of the leaders, believe that trade is extremely important for continued economic growth. So the messages that are sent from the G20 are very, very important. I think it's already been a success to have China and the United States sign on to the global climate change agreement, and just incredibly important.
I think it was a very comprehensive speech. He was very confident and very resolute about his commitment, both in terms of the development of China and the 5-year plan and the transformation that's going to go on in the Chinese economy as it moves to a more open market economy, but also a more innovation and creative economy. I thought that was very powerful, also mixed with how we would deal with the environment, how we would deal with increase in living standards. So some very positive, important things.
Well, economy is taking center stage at the G20 Summit in Hangzhou, and now let's get more discussion from our studio guests here. So, Mr. Liu, I'd like to ask you this. The world is undergoing profound changes, undergoing a lot of difficulties, for example, soaring debt, rising unemployment, and sluggish trade. Can we expect quick fix to all these problems?
We have heard from President Xi Jinping that the current problems have their symptoms and root causes. For a summit of 2 days, I think it's impossible for us to expect that everything will be fixed, through this summit. But I think it's a good thing that the participants of the Hangzhou Summit have jointly identified the symptoms as well as the root causes to the current problems. And President Xi Jinping in a minute will talk to the international community as a whole. What are the roadmaps that the leaders have reached a consensus on? And what are the concrete measures that the countries are going to take? And what are the roadmaps for the future development of the global trade, and also the global governance mechanism that's going to be more on the working site?
And previously, President Xi Jinping was making speeches at the opening of the B20 Summit, and yesterday again he made speech in front of all the leaders attending this year's G20 Summit. And those were full of confidence, which provided the much-needed assurance for the world economy. He's confident that China's economy will still grow at a medium to high speed. How important is this message of confidence to the rest of the world, who are now looking at Asia and especially China as the engine of growth?
It's vitally important because if you, as your coverage went through, it's not a completely happy time internationally, economically, with low growth. Trade is flat, or even earlier this year has talked about declining. There is wage stagnation in many countries and a sense of inequality. So globalization and trade itself is not getting a good PR, as it were, internationally. And it needs then a change of course from talking about the problems to moving a roadmap. We keep using that term, that gives confidence. And I think that's what China can do at this stage, of build that consensus that has an ultimate optimistic foundation.
And talking about globalization, there seems to be an anti-globalization sentiment going on in the world, with countries pointing fingers at each other, saying that you are building this barrier of free trade. How should we understand this problem? I mean, of course, there shouldn't be a lot of finger pointing, but what's the key to solving all these problems? Mr. Russell?
I think ultimately it's an attitude and a consensus amongst the key countries, of which most of them, all of them are sitting around that table, to move forward in a collective, or at least in the same direction, to build synergies. It's moving from dialogue into consensus, and to then build solutions that they can all go back to their constituencies. And remember, these are 20 politicians that have domestic constituencies that they have also to cater for. So to go back and give them hope and optimism that there is a road forward.
Now, you mentioned this different stages, from dialogue to consensus, and to really implement their plans. Which stage do you think we're at right now, at this moment in time?
I think it'll depend on what comes out of today, but I think it's a matter of building consensus, and we've seen some of it already, on that climate change and solutions to climate change can have consensus, even from the two largest economies and the two largest powers.
Exactly.
And it's building out from that on other areas. We hope, and it's to open up more consensus on development as a mechanism and a driver for growth. And then it's the innovation and technology, and we have then got a mechanism to at least offer hope to those that feel somewhat pessimistic at this point in time.
It's really important that you brought this up, this climate deal between China and the U.S. Previously, the 23 countries on board the Paris Agreement only account for 1% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And now with China and the U.S. on board, together they are accounting 41%. So it really matters. How significant do you think this climate deal is, even though the G20 summit centers on economic discussions?
According to the game rules of the international politics, it is the major powers that matter in whatever the international is trying to reach. In this issue of climate change, U.S. and China as the biggest and second largest the emitting countries in terms of harmful materials, when the two are taking the joint action, when the two countries have reached the consensus on how to push forward in terms of the governance on the climate change, it gives more incentives for some other countries which are still riding on the fences. And secondly, when the US and China are working together seriously on something, it will produce the spillover effects. For example, U.S. and China could jointly provide the technology transfer in this regard. It could provide the funding to the least developing countries. And thirdly, both U.S. and China would have its own friends and partnership countries. They will give the kind of push for other countries to follow the suit. I think in one word, when U.S. and China jointly submit the approval of the agreement, it will help to expedite the whole process for this very vital agreement to be fully implementable.
So a shared goal and shared responsibility.
Yes,
Gentlemen,
right.
Let's now take a short break. We'll be getting back to you later on in the show. You're watching News Desk. Stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of the G20 Summit in Hangzhou. And right before our break, Mr. Rosso trying to add something to Mr. Liu's discussions, the economic implications of this climate agreement between China and the U.S.
Yeah, I would like to pick up from what Dr. Liu was talking about this commitment that China and the U.S. have made, the implications that leads towards structural reform. And particularly if you look at in financing, last week the People's Bank of China said for China to reach its commitment will cost investment of $450 billion a year for the next 15 years. The central government can only provide 15% of that. So the rest will be coming by financing, green financing. Even the normal banking system will have to be reformed. So the introduction of green bonds and a whole range of changes in the financial system to allow China to become a low carbon or lower carbon economy. So this is where these decisions, if they're followed through, have profound effects on the structure of the economy.
And how does the green growth, Mr. Liu, fit into these 4 I's, the theme of this year's G20 Summit? Does it apply to one single concept, or is it logically connected to all these 4 concepts?
Definitely, it's interconnected with all these 4 I's. Let me just start from the kind of innovation. Because currently many countries, especially developing countries, have been implementing the economic growth modality, which is based on the bulky consumption of the materials and production factors, so to speak. And many countries do not have the technologies and the capital to carry out the kind of environment protection projects. So in this way, when we help the international community, especially the developing countries, to push ahead the green development, it will help to reduce the conditions which would have been hampering the healthy growth of the global economy. Secondly, with regard to the kind of reinvigoration of the economic growth, currently all the economic modalities are having less power to ensure the kind of sustainable development. I think with this green modality come into being or come into force, countries and the governments would be in the capacity to solicit more funding to push for the economic growth, because the green economy itself is a new steam for the national economic development. Thirdly, it is with regard to the interconnectivity. I think this is the cooperation of the joint construction of the infrastructure projects would have to provide better conditions for the sustainable development. I think inclusive development would, of course, include the green growth.
Well, thank you for your insights, gentlemen. Now let's go back to our reporter Su Yuting, who's standing by in Hangzhou at the press conference venue where Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to brief the media. Well, Yuting, President Xi is going to be there in a short moment. What can you tell us about the content of President's speech to the media? Do we know some of the outlines that he would make?
Yes, Mama, you know that the press conference is scheduled to begin very, very soon. And right now, President Xi Jinping has held a meeting with other G20 members. It seems that they have lots of discussion to talk about on the global economic governance. And as you can see behind me, nearly 600 journalists are now waiting here quiet. And for a long time, they're now waiting for President Xi Jinping to deliver a speech. And we know that China is going to cooperate with other G20 members to promote the implementation of the 2030 agenda for the sustainable development. So development is a very important keyword that President Xi Jinping is about to mention. And another thing is very important is innovation. As you know that the sluggish world economic recovery has indicated that the traditional QE policies and fiscal policies can no longer solve the long-term structural problems. So right now, innovative ways are strongly needed to solve the problem. And China has already initiated the Belt and Road Initiative and also the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Those are the very new innovative ways to solve the challenges that the whole world economy facing now. And you know that previously I've talked to a senior official from Foreign Ministry. She told me that during this press conference, President Xi Jinping is about to deliver a joint communique, and he will also to say something about the nearly 30 outcomes. So that will make this year's Hangzhou G20 Summit one of the very fruitful ones. And another highlight that I want to mention is that this year's G20 Summit is also typically representative and inclusive. Why I'm saying so? Because this year's summit, you know that the developing countries invited to this year's summit is larger than any other previous ones. So that is very important. As previously I talked to a Malawi reporter, he told me that he's very glad that the developing countries are no longer marginalized. And as China is transforming from a participant to a leader in the global economic governance, so that's all the very historical transformation and changes that the whole world is paying attention to. So right now, we're just waiting for President Xi Jinping to come in this meeting hall at the second floor, and everyone is quite excited, and they also are very keen to hear what President Xi Jinping will say to the audiences, to the journalists, and to the whole world. Back to you, Mang.
Thanks very much, Yuting, for bringing us that from the conference venue, press conference venue in Hangzhou. Appreciate it. And now let's get back to our studio discussion here. Mr. Russell, our reporter Yuting just mentioned that China has invited the maximum number of emerging economies and developing countries to this year's G20 Summit. So what kind of role do you think China could play in trying to connect the developing world and the developed world? Also to promote this interconnectivity within countries under this G20 framework?
Well, I think putting it in the context, in many ways, the G20 at this point in time is the only international platform that seems available. The Doha round is more or less dead. It was meant to fully address the needs of promoting development. And in many ways, other international fora are less suitable. Even APEC has been reluctant to address rural development and poverty alleviation. And developing countries face enormous tasks, in as much as the present trading system is, I hate to say it, stacked up against them. In as much as normally agricultural and commodities and resources have 2 to 3 times the tariff levels of manufactured goods, and also suffer peaks in tariffs for many key products that they are competitive in. The other thing is there's a system of tariff escalation. So this, and they're not participating in that what's known as global value chains, which has been the secret of Asia's success in manufactured goods, by moving products and building value through various countries, that has been lost on many countries, particularly Africa, to a certain extent Central America, and certainly parts of the Middle East and Central Asia. So it's very important to readdress this, because if they're not addressed, it tends to lead to poverty, ongoing entrenched poverty, political instability, and problems internationally.
So the core reason that emerging economies have been somewhat marginalized in this international trade system is probably because their strategies are not in line, are not on the same page with those of the developed world. So how could countries better align their strategies so that they could seek common development? Mr. Liu.
Well, I think, let me just follow up with what Mr. Russell said. Originally, the global issues were dictated by the seven G7s. They were the countries that called the shot. Now the situations have been changing. As I recall, 10 years ago, those countries would make up of 70% of the global economy. Now they have been reduced to 30-some%. And traditionally, it is the developed economies that would provide the streams for other countries to follow and to expedite their economic development. But since the financial crisis some 8 years ago, the thing is not happening. And secondly, China is in a better position because China knows the pains and the expectations from both sides. And from the global economic perspectives, through all the value chains, China is just standing below. So it's in the capacity to outreach and to downreach. And so China is in a better dialogue positions with both sides. And that is why China is using up the advantage of being the host country to invite this many representatives from the developing world so that they can come together. They compare notes, they hear the stories of the other side, they compare the notes to compare the expectations so that they can reach a better inclusive consensus.
And I think that vision is being well illustrated in the logo of this year's G20 Summit. You can see this bridge trying to connect the developing and the developed world. And talking about developing nations, let me mention this. Leaders from the 5 BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have met in Hangzhou to discuss furthering cooperation. China's President Xi Jinping called on the group to play a greater role in international economic governance.
The BRICS countries are the champions of the emerging market countries and developing countries. They are important members of the G20. We should follow the historical and global trends, strengthen coordination and cooperation, strengthen and build the 2 major platforms of BRICS and G20, and enable emerging markets and developing countries to play a bigger role in international affairs and take a more advantageous position in global governance.
And that's being echoed by experts. They say that emerging markets, especially the BRICS countries, will be critical to world economic recovery and growth. CCTV's Lin Nan has more on this.
Focusing on building an innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive world economy, the G20 Hangzhou Summit provides world leaders a platform to discuss how to help the global economy recover and boost its growth. Experts say emerging market economies will be the driving force in achieving the summit's goal.
Over the last, I'd say, 2-3 years, since commodity prices have declined, the emerging markets have obviously seen a decline in their economic growth patterns, but these things are cyclical, as you know. Once commodity prices pick up again, because of the strong demographics in countries like China and countries like Brazil, in the rest of Africa, the emerging markets will again occupy center stage as an engine of growth over the next number of years.
As the world economy transitions towards a balanced, sustainable, and inclusive growth, Experts believe emerging economies, especially Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have a critical role to play.
And if you look at China, for example, we are transitioning from, an export-driven, used to be a production and labor center, to a consumer-oriented economy. That transitioning is happening, and that is helping, and that's contributing to the changes in the global economic agenda. We are clearly stepping up in significant policy issues, significant changes to drive a balanced agenda.
A series of mechanisms for dialogue will further strengthen cooperation and communication among BRICS. After the G20 meeting, this year's BRICS Summit will be held in India in mid-October. Li Nan, CCTV, Hangzhou.
And this year's summit has placed great emphasis on the development agenda, which developing countries, including the BRICS nations, have closely followed. Russian national television ran a series on the Hangzhou summit days before the meeting started. And on the opening day of the G20 summit, state TV had rolling coverage on meetings between Russian and Chinese leaders. Russian English TV channel Russia Today also reported on the G20 gala on Monday night. Indian national TV had special coverage of the G20 summit, providing insight into this year's main theme and discussion topics. The G20 meeting also attracted a fair share of social media attention. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi posted the G20 family photo and a photo of the Chinese paintings he received as a gift on his social media account. And South Africa's 24-hour news network focused on the BRICS informal meeting. It said BRICS leaders are confident of fruitful outcomes from the G20 summit. And over in Brazil, the country's largest newspaper discussed the BRICS meeting at length. During a media interview, Brazil President Michel Temer said he had a successful meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping and looks forward to developing stronger ties. And let's turn back to our studio guests here. So let's talk more about the role of developing countries in trying to inject new vitality into the world economy. Mr. Russell, what are your visions into this?
Well, invariably, it is a fact that low-income countries go through a high-growth phase. And so, in many ways, by bringing these countries more into the global economy, rather than being traders outside the mainstream of the economy, then there is a potential for high growth. And as I said, then it opens up, once you move up that path, a whole range of other industries, services open up. As increasing GDP per capita, you move to a more, as China is, more consumption, more healthcare, quality of life, all the mortality, infant maternal mortalities drop, the rates rather, life expectancy, and it opens up markets. And these invariably are countries that have high percentage of youth, and so they have great potential to offer, in the right path, high growth rates.
So a lot of these countries, the emerging economies, are in Asia. I mean, Asia is quite complicated in the sense that it has some of the world's richest and poorest countries. So, Mr. Liu, why do you think Asia could still keep this momentum of growth while the other part of the world economy is undergoing major difficulties? Can Asia still capable of delivering some expectations of the world economy?
From the growth side, Asia has the two largest populations, namely China and India. When these two
and Indonesia is catching up.
Yes,
now
catching up. Yes,
fourth populous country.
And so when these three countries manage to maintain the momentum of economic growth, they would produce steam to pull or to drive the other countries in the region to move forward. And secondly, one of the tricks about the 21st century is the consumption capability would mainly come from the middle class. Just remember, China and India and Indonesia have about more than 30% of the global population, and more than that, the growth of the middle class will be coming mainly from these three countries. Because as I noticed, the middle class from the developed economies have been plateaued out. They have little scope for further growth. But in Asian countries, they're just beginning to wake up. So when the economic engines of the major economies in Asia continue to move forward, I think this consumption capability would provide the steam. And thirdly, it is the market. All the global production chains and value chains would need to have the downstream consuming markets, which are located mainly here. So, and labor, number 4. All the, especially countries like India, Indonesia, including China, are having the, benefits of the young labor power who comes into the market on an annual basis. All these factors would make sure that the Asian economies would, together continue to perform the major pushing or the steam for the growth of the global economy.
So does economic growth in these countries, very populous countries, have to do with their population? Is it a result of their population dividends?
Yeah,
that's part of it.
Yes.
And also access to investment and an environment that promotes and encourages growth and economic activity, and a range of things that are part of the G20 agenda, entrepreneurship and so on, particularly what the B20 has been promoting. It's like a recipe of getting the right recipe and the components together, and you do get takeoff. And this is where G20, by having an exchange of views, cooperation, and leading in a broad direction, can assist that development. The one point I would pick up, just to add to Dr. Liu, trade is relatively flat, but intra-Asian trade is growing and booming. That means, for whatever reason, you can analyze Asia with Southeast Asia moving up through China and then out to other markets, or linking the economies through these, what the term value chains or supply chains, brings prosperity to all along that supply chain.
Let me just add a little bit in this regard.
Yes.
Asia is standing in a very favorable condition in terms of sustainable economic growth, simply because China is situated in Asia. China currently contributes more than 30% of the global growth. And China has launched the Belt and Road initiatives, would help to boost the infrastructure construction, the industrial cooperation, the closer cooperation in terms of trade and investment. All these things would make sure that Asia would continue to stand in a favorable condition, because Belt and Road starts from Asia.
Well, this major problem in Asia, many analysts say that protectionism, Asia seems to be the major victim of protectionism in the world economy. What are your takes on this, Mr. Russell?
Well, certainly there are a lot of anti-dumping, countervailing duties cases, and normally it's in areas and sectors that are facing stress in the developed markets, and then it leads to, particularly you look at steel, you look at a range of pulp and paper issues, infrastructure issues, normally lead to this protectionism. It normally accompanies, particularly in Europe or North America, where there's been lack of investment, but there's a gap between lack of investment and competitivity, but have high political leverage.
Let me just add one point for the consumption of audience. The issue of anti-dumping issue is relatively small issue in comparison with the the total trade growth. Last year, China, reached the total volume of export and import of 500,000 billion US dollars. The number, which is subjective to the anti-dumping, anti-subsidy investigations, is less than 1%. So it's a manageable, issue. One thing is always true in the field of economics. Mature economic and trade relations are bound to be followed by the complicated issues like anti-dumping and anti-subsidy issues. We have to move forward, but the government's concerned would have to, tackle the issue positively, so that in order to provide a level playing field for companies from all the stakeholders to enjoy a better future.
And gentlemen, I want to leave you there for a moment. While G20 leaders discuss pressing issues concerning global economic development, their spouses are by no means just staying on the sidelines. The wife of Chinese President Xi Jinping and World Health Organization Goodwill Ambassador Peng Liyuan has attended an event promoting AIDS prevention. Alongside other spouses of G20 heads of state, the attendees are taking part in this event, which aims to spread knowledge about AIDS prevention by using the influence of public figures. And staying with this topic, in China, AIDS is one of the leading causes of deaths associated with HIV. However, talk of this remains a taboo topic among Chinese. But the country has been gradually stepping up efforts in AIDS prevention, especially through education. And in recent years, schools have launched AIDS awareness campaigns. Our Lin Nan brings us more.
Sex and sexually transmitted diseases have been taboo topics in China for long, but as the country takes steps to bolster its AIDS prevention efforts, it has required teachers to discuss them in the classroom. Youth groups are the most vulnerable to the disease because of a lack of access to information.
University is a critical stage for students to develop a healthy lifestyle after leaving home. Although China is a low epidemic area as a whole, students are a vulnerable group. It is very important to teach them knowledge of the disease.
Madame Peng Liyuan is the World Health Organization's Goodwill Ambassador for Tuberculosis and AIDS. She's attended numerous campaigns and filmed a video to raise more awareness of the disease.
Education plays a crucial role in efforts to prevent the spread of AIDS. It raises awareness, explains how the disease is transmitted, and reduces discrimination against people with HIV.
National health authorities have launched the Red Ribbon campaign and worked with schools across the country. Zhejiang University, for instance, introduced sex education and organized volunteering events for many years.
We have designed different teaching programs according to the students' lifestyle and habits. For example, we give lectures about how to prevent AIDS infection in youth hostels or some interaction programs, so they can better absorb the knowledge.
In an event, volunteers pretended they were infected people and tried to hug me. And I dodged by instinct, even if I knew it can't be transmitted by hugging. I felt ashamed to have such a reaction and showed empathy for the infected people when I saw them crying. It was a powerful lesson.
More sex education programs and facilities will be brought to Chinese campuses to ensure young people's participation in the fight against AIDS. Lin Nan, CCTV, Hangzhou.
So a lot of things are happening on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. And now let's turn back to our studio guests here. I'd like to get your insights on this. We're still waiting for the outcome of the G20 Summit. President Xi Jinping is going to brief the media on the major outcomes. Analysts say that we'll be expecting something like over 30 agreements, and that's going to be the most fruitful since the history, since the G20 was founded. And also, a moment ago, Mr. Russell, you mentioned that the G20 platform was set up at the height of the financial crisis back in 2008. And now the task is to transform this platform from a crisis response mechanism to one that's capable of allowing countries to have a stronger say, better control of economic governance. So what is the major obstacle in this transition process? Mr. Russell?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think there is prevailing protectionism. I think in your earlier coverage you brought out some figures, but since 2009, when more or less the G20 started, I think it's about just under 1,600 protectionist measures have been brought in by the governments of the G20. And the prevailing rate of bringing in new ones and doing trade facilitation is running at about 2 to 1 in the last year or two. So it's kind of turning around the tide of protectionism. I think the other thing is populism, and we've seen a lot of that, and it's rising and is a rising issue in many countries, not only the United States, but what we see with Brexit and those the vote there is a disillusionment with globalization and so on. So that is again needs to be stemmed with an alternative strategy. I think fundamentally the message has to come out that protectionism is not the answer for the global economy moving forward.
Yeah, let me just add a little bit. Go ahead. You know, the reasons why this transition is so slow to come, I can add a little bit more, a couple of more. The first thing is the stages of economic development of the developed and the developing countries are vastly different.
They're at different development stages, so it's difficult to align their strategies.
The economic scales, economic, comprehensive power, and the capacity to carry out the trade, the investment. And I think one more thing is since the collective economic scale of the developed economies have been shrinking, they are not that kind of comfortable to allow the developing countries to come over and take over the exclusive rights of say in dictating the orientation of the economic development and the issues on how to manage the different issues. So these are the, and last but not least, there has been the lack of dialogues and the meetings of the leaders between the developed and the developing world. I think the Hangzhou Summit has come out in front and set the stage from the leaderships from both camps so that they can have the dialogues and to reach the consensus and to draw up the roadmap.
So apparently there's an urgent need for countries under this G20 platform to coordinate their fiscal and monetary policies so that they can work together to increase their ability to govern the global economy. However, at the same time, is there a lack of communication and coordination on major policymakers? Mr. Russell?
Could I come back to the point
you
just made when you said it's up to monetary and fiscal coordination? I think that's the key. It's run out of steam. We've got many of these countries already in negative interest rates. So monetary policy is just running out of arrows to fire at the target. And fiscal also has limitations for many countries. Because they're already highly indebted now. So there's a few countries, certainly Asia, and can have fiscal stimulus and so on, but there's not any. The US maybe, but Europe, Japan, perhaps not. So there needs to be a new approach and looking for new avenues for growth. And this is innovative growth. I come back to that.
Yes, of course, but what could be the economic implications given the political uncertainty in countries, in European countries, with Brexit already happening and it'll be election year in Germany. So what could be the economic implications in this?
Let me just say what I know in this regard. We have to know this. The market economy, the foundation of the market economy in the bulk of the EU countries are still there. The economic crisis and the sovereign debt crisis are just the hiccups the basic fundamentals are still there. And the EU economy is turning around. But because of lack of the new technologies and new industries, they are still trying their effort to make these things to happen.
So that goes back to the concept of innovation.
Yeah. I think when this issue of innovation is resolved, we are going to see the EU economies to grow. And the U.S. economy is a good example. I think right at the moment, U.S. is the only country that has come to the normal stage of economic growth. All the others just follow up. It's just like a marathon. It's decided at the end of the track, not in the middle of it.
So when you talk about innovation, are you more referring to a wave of scientific and technological advancement, or rather it's in the sense of institutional changes and of course the mentality?
More than that. Number one is the modality, the growth modality. And the second is the economic structure. And the third is the technology innovation or renovation. And third is the consumption kind of modality. And number fifth is the international cooperation, because against the backdrop of the globalization, no country or no area can afford to do the things on its own. So the international cooperation is the fundamental thing to talk about at the moment.
So do you agree, Mr. Russell, with what Mr. Liu just said?
Yes, I certainly do. And just to elaborate on what the technology innovation, we're talking about the digital economy. President Xi in his initial speeches talked about marrying the virtual economy with the real economy, and bringing in new areas of internet, which China has the internet plus, virtual reality and artificial intelligence.
You name it, there's a long list.
There's a whole range of things. And also retrofitting old industries by making them more low carbon, or lowering the environmental impact and bringing in new environmental technologies. That requires a restructuring of the economies, and it also requires an emphasis on all economies to get into a virtuous circle of infrastructure spending. So that's two key elements to the G20 in the last 2 days.
So this circle of infrastructure spending, is it equally important for developing and developed countries?
Yes, the nature of the infrastructure will be different. The two groups, will vary from country to country, and that's the interconnectivity too.
I can testify with my personal experience. I've been traveling to the U.S. constantly over the past 20-some years. Overall, the U.S. infrastructure is getting to the grandpa's age. The bulk of the infrastructure networks were built during the economic crisis of the 30s of the last century. So I think I also traveled to Europe. I think in terms of the infrastructure network across the region, across the countries, I think both European and the U.S. areas needs to drastically push up the infrastructure shortboard.
And gentlemen, talking about infrastructure construction, let's also take a look at the night scene from the host city of this year's G20 Summit, Hangzhou. And this, what we're seeing now, is the main venue of this year's meeting, and Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to brief the media in just a short moment. And this year's meeting, the G20 Summit in Hangzhou, is China, as the host country, has invited heads of state from G20 members, as well as guest countries, and also executives from international organizations. This very representative representation of the G20 members and also the world economy. So gentlemen, we were talking about infrastructure, whether there's a difference between developing and the developed world. Mr. Liu mentioned that developed countries now seem to have a need to upgrade their infrastructure.
So in one word, the closer cooperation in the areas of infrastructure may stand out as one of the key areas where we could expand the convergence of interest. So I think this is one thing. And secondly, the closer cooperation in the areas of infrastructure construction, we could provide better conditions for the economy to grow sustainably.
Is infrastructure having the potential to become the new growth points for the world economy?
The value of infrastructure is, unlike giving benefits or giving handouts, it essentially is designed to grow the economy. And I think there's an old Chinese proverb that build a road and you bring prosperity.
And that's exactly what China is trying to do with its Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to link Asia, Africa, Europe, Middle East.
Yeah, and just picking up the differences between countries and different levels of development. China...
We have to leave you there because China's President Xi Jinping is now going to brief the media on the major outcomes of this year's G20 Summit in Hangzhou.
尊敬的习近平主席，各位来宾、记者朋友们，大家下午好。
President Xi Jinping,
中华人民
distinguished
共和国主
guests,
席习近平阁
friends
下
from the
会见
press,
中外记
good
者，现
afternoon.
在开始。
Now begins the press conference of President Xi Jinping.
Your Excellency President Xi Jinping, distinguished guests, friends from the press, good afternoon. President Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China is here to meet with Chinese and foreign press.
现在请习近平主席讲话。
Now, let me give the floor to the President.
各位记者朋友、女士们、先生们，
Friends
大家
from the
好。
press, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon.
20个集团领导人第11次
The
峰会
11th G20 Summit
刚刚圆满
has
结束。
just concluded with great success.
会上，各成员、
In the
嘉
last 2
宾国
days,
领导人
leaders
和
from
国际
G20 members,
组织负责
guest
人
countries, and international
围绕
organizations
构建创
have
新
engaged
活
in
力
in-depth discussions
联动
under the
包
theme
容
towards
的世
an
界经济
innovative,
的
invigorated,
峰会主题，
interconnected, and inclusive
就加
world
强政策
economy.
协调、
More
创新
specifically,
增长方式、
strengthening policy coordination
更
and
高
breaking
效
a
的
new path for
全
growth,
球经济金
more
融治理、
effective and efficient global economic
强
and
劲
financial
的
governance,
国际贸易和投
robust
资、
international trade and investment,
包容和联动
and
式发展
inclusive
等议
and
题
interconnected development.
深入交换了意见，共同探讨
We
影
also
响世界经
covered
济的
other
其他
issues
的
affecting the world economy
共商世界经济
and explored
增
ways
长
to
与合作大
enhance
计
global economic growth
达成了
and
广泛
cooperation.
共识。
The participating leaders reached
会
extensive
议
consensus
通过了
on these
20个集团
topics.
领导人杭州峰
The
会
leaders'
公报
communique adopted at the
进一
G20
步明
Hangzhou
确了
Summit
20个
has
集
made
团
clearer
合作的
the
发
direction,
展方向、目标，
goals, and measures for G20
就
cooperation.
推动世界经济增长，
It
形成了
contains
着眼
the
长远、
Hangzhou Consensus
综合
on
施
world
策、
economic growth,
开放创新、
featuring
包容
vision,
发展的
integration,
杭州共识。
openness, and inclusiveness.
杭州峰会
The Hangzhou Summit
恰逢世界经
is
济增
convened
长
at a crucial
和
juncture,
20个集团转
both
型
for the
的
world economy
关键
and
节
for the
点。
transformation of the G20.
世界经济复苏乏力，
As we meet global recovery
国际和地
lacks
区热点
momentum.
问题，
International
以及全
and
球性
regional
挑战
issues, as well as global
对世界
challenges,
经济的影响
are clearly
不容忽视。
weighing down growth,
各类风险和不
and the
确定
various
性
risks and
仍然比较突
uncertainties
出。
remain acute.
因此，峰会受到
Against
国际
this
社会的
backdrop,
广泛关
The
注，
eyes of the world
也承
are
载
on
了
this summit,
各方的高度期
and
待。
people look to Hangzhou with high expectations.
在各成员嘉宾国、国际组织
Thanks to the
一道
joint
努力下
efforts of all G20 members,
会议取得了
guest countries,
丰硕的成
and
果，
international
实现了
organizations,
预期的
the
目标。
summit concluded with fruitful outcomes
下面我
and
向大
achieved
家简
its
要地
desired
介绍
goal. Now
会
let
议
me
主要成
briefly walk you through the main outcomes of the summit. First, we resolved to point the way and set the course for the world economy. G20 leaders all agreed that the risks and challenges facing the world economy make it crucial to maintain a peaceful and stable international environment. The G20 must display the spirit of solidarity and partnership by intensifying macro policy coordination, following through on the Hangzhou Action Plan, and leveraging various effective tools at our disposal, including fiscal and monetary policies and structural reforms. While guarding against and responding to short-term risks, we need to do more to unlock the potential for medium and long-term growth. While expanding aggregate demand, we also need to improve the quality of supply. We are confident that through the concerted efforts of all parties, we will be able to restore the world economy back to strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. Second, we resolved to break a new path for growth and instill new dynamism into the world economy. Experience teaches that the old approach of simply relying on fiscal and monetary policies no longer works. We need to reignite the engine of growth via innovation to usher in the next round of growth and prosperity. In the G20 blueprint on innovative growth that we have adopted, we envisioned an all-dimensional, multi-tiered, and wide-ranging approach to innovation, which is driven by innovation in science and technology, but goes beyond it to cover development philosophy, institutional mechanism, and business models, so that the benefits of innovation will be shared by all. With focus on structural reform, we outlined the priority areas, guiding principles, and a set of indicators to fundamentally remove the bottlenecks of economic growth. In the area of new industrial revolution, we agreed to vigorously develop advanced and high-end manufacturing to spearhead the fourth industrial revolution. Capitalizing on digital economy, we will encourage the extensive use of internet technologies across economy and society to embrace a new era of connection between things and amongst people. This blueprint, which encapsulates our shared vision, planned actions, and institutional safeguards, will open up new horizons for global growth. Third, we resolved to improve global economic and financial governance to enhance the resilience of the world economy. The G20 has been a standard bearer for improving global economic and financial governance, where we have made new progress this year. Building on the implementation of the 2010 IMF reform package, we agreed to further advance quota and voting power reforms of international financial institutions. We expressed our hope that the IMF will work towards the completion of a new quota reform plan as scheduled, and that the World Bank will implement its shareholding review according to the agreed roadmap and timeframe, with the objective of achieving equitable voting power over time, so as to enhance the representation and voice of emerging markets and developing countries. We studied the possibility of broadening the use of special drawing rights. The World Bank has taken the lead in issuing SDR-denominated bonds, in China.
国际货币和金融体系日益完善。
All of this will contribute to the improvement of the current international monetary and
加强
financial
落实各
systems.
项金融改革举措，
G20 leaders also resolved
发起
to
全
take
球
more robust
和
measures
区域
to enforce
金融
various
安全
financial
网应
reforms.
对风险的联合演
A
练，
joint test run of global and
筑牢防
regional
范
financial safety nets
金融
will
危
be
机的
conducted
堤坝。
to build a strong bulwark against
我们
financial
决定深
crises.
化国际税收合作，
We decided to deepen
加大打击
international tax cooperation,
逃避税行为力
step up
度，
the fight against tax evasion
支持发
and
展中国家
avoidance,
税收能力的建
and
设，
support developing countries in
通过
building
税收促
capacity
进全球投资
so as to
和
boost
经济
global
增长。
investment and growth via robust tax
中国
measures.
将建立一个国际税收政策
China
研究中
will
心，
make its own
做出
contribution
自身贡献。
by establishing an international tax policy
我们
research
共同制
center,
定20国集团，提高亚
hoping to
太地区
improve
能
the
源可及性
efficacy
行
of
动
global
计划
energy governance.
可再生能
We
源
drew up the action
行动
plan
计划，
on enhancing energy access
决定
in
开展
Asia and the Pacific,
能效引领
and the
项目，
G20 voluntary
提
action
升全
plan
球
on renewable
能源治
energy,
理的有效性。
and decided to launch a G20 energy efficiency leading
我们今
program.
年在反腐败领域
Breakthroughs have been made this
追
year
逃
in
追赃
counter-corruption
取
cooperation.
得了突破性进展，制定了追逃追赃的高级原
We
则。
endorsed the G20 high-level
在华设
principles
立
on
反腐败追逃追
cooperation
赃
on persons
研究
sought
中
for
心，
corruption and asset recovery,
制定20国集
agreed to
团
set up a research center
2017
on
至
anti-corruption
2018
cooperation
反
in
腐败
China
行动
and
计划，
adopted the G20 2017 to 2018 anti-corruption action plan.
行动
Through these
三位
efforts,
一体
we have created
国际
an international
反腐败
anti-corruption
格局，
framework combining principles,
让腐败分子
mechanisms, and actions
在20国集团
that will
乃
deny
至全球更大
perpetrators
范
of
围
corruption any
无处
sanctuary
藏身，
in G20
无
members
所遁
and
形。
worldwide.
第四，
Fourth,
我们决心重
we
振国
resolved
际贸
to
易和投
revitalize
资这两大
international trade and investment
构建
as key
开放型
engines of
世界
growth
经济。
and build an open
我
world
们
economy.
一致同意
We agreed
加强
to
20国集
improve
团
the
贸易
G20
和投资
trade
机
and
制建设，
investment mechanisms,
共同制定20国集团全
endorse
球贸易
the
增长
G20
战略，
strategy for global trade
促
growth,
进包容协调的
and move
全
towards
球价值链发展，
inclusive and coordinated
支
global
持
value
多边贸易
chains.
体制，反对
We
保
support
护主
the
义，
multilateral trading
释
regime
放全
and
球经贸
oppose
合作的潜力，
protectionism, so as to
扭
release
转
the
全球贸易
potential
增长
of
下
global
滑趋
business
势。
cooperation and reverse the decline of
我
global
们制
trade
定了
growth.
20国集团全球
The
投资
G20
指导
guiding
原则，
principles for global investment
这是全球
policymaking
首
we have
个
adopted
多
is the
边投
world's
资规则框
first
架，
framework of
填补了
multilateral investment
国际
rules.
投资领域空白。对促进20国集
It
团
is also
从
a
危机应
milestone
对
in the
向
G20's
长效治理
transformation
机制的转
from
变，
a crisis
也
response
具有
mechanism
里程碑意
to
义。
one of long-term governance.
我们的上述举措
These measures,
致力于打破藩
aimed
篱，
at removing obstacles
畅
of
通
trade,
梗阻，
will
使
improve
全球资
efficiency
源要素
in the flow
货
of
物、物流、
resources,
服务
factors of production,
顺畅高效流
goods,
通，
and
更
services,
好地助推世界经济增长，
facilitate world economic growth,
更好地推进
and
经
advance
济全球化进
economic
程。
globalization.
第五，
Fifth,
我们决心推动
we
包容
resolved
和
to
联
promote
动式
inclusive
发展，
and interconnected
让
development
20国集团合作成果
so that
惠及
G20
全球。
cooperation will deliver benefits to the whole
中国
world.
是最大的发展中国家。
China is the largest developing country,
杭州峰会体现
and
了
the
鲜明
Hangzhou
的发
Summit
展视角，
has demonstrated a clear
取得了
focus
丰硕
on
的发展
development
成果。
and attained fruitful achievements in this
今年
area.
我们在发展领域
This year,
实现了
we have
三个第一
realized
次。
three firsts in the field of development.
第一次
The first time
把发展问题
that
置于
development
全球宏观
has
政策
featured
框架的
prominently
突出位
in
置。
global macro policy framework.
第一次
The first time
就落实联合国
that an action plan
2030
has
年
been
可持续
adopted
发展议程
on the
制
2030
定行
Agenda
动计划。
for Sustainable Development.
第一次
And
集
the
体
first
支持
time
非洲
that G20 as a group has lent its support to industrialization in Africa and least developed countries. All these are pioneering moves in the G20's history. We have also agreed to take the lead in implementing the Paris Agreement on climate change and push for early entry into force and implementation of the Paris Agreement, aiming to reduce inequality and imbalance in global development. We have adopted the Entrepreneurship Action Plan, launched the Global Infrastructure Connectivity Alliance, and achieved practical results in inclusive business, food security, and other fields. In so doing, we hope to send the signal to the world that the G20 belongs not only to its members, but also to the whole world. Our goal is to ensure that growth and development will benefit all countries and the overwhelming majority of their peoples equitably.
We also realize that under the current circumstances, the G20 needs to better play its role as the premier forum for international economic cooperation. It needs to further shift from a mechanism for crisis response to one of long-term governance, from emphasizing short-term policies to balancing short, medium, and long-term policies, and from demand-side management to supply-side reform. We all agreed that the transformation of the G20 will affect the immediate interests of all members and the future of the world economy. To maintain the G20's vitality, we must embrace change and progress with the times. We are determined to support the G20's continued focus on the most prominent, important, and pressing challenges of the world economy. We will strengthen policy coordination, improve mechanisms, and solidly implement the summit outcomes so as to achieve strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth of the world economy. Finally, I wish to acknowledge that the active support and assistance the Chinese presidency has received over the past year from the G20 members, guest countries, and international organizations. We have achieved fruitful outcomes by hosting over 70 meetings and adopting 29 initiatives. None of this would have happened without the concerted efforts of all concerned parties. And as the host country, we wish to thank all G20 members, guest countries, and international organizations for their important contributions to the success of the Hangzhou Summit. Our thanks also go to B20, T20, L20, W20, Y20, C20, and so on for contributing brilliant ideas to the success of the Hangzhou Summit and the development of G20. After today, we will continue working with all sides to implement and advance the outcomes of the Hangzhou Summit. Dear reporters, ladies and gentlemen, Let me also take this opportunity to thank the media for your attention and support over the past year. You have recorded the exciting moments of China's G20 presidency. You have conveyed to the world the success of the summit and the beauty of the West Lake, and you have made the leaders' commitments known to people of all countries. It is your hard work that helped to seal China's mark on the G20. In closing, I hope you will remember fondly about China's Zhejiang province and this Hangzhou Summit, and I hope that this will prompt you to come back someday to renew your enduring memories of Hangzhou. Thank you for your attention.
谢谢习近平主席，记者会到此结束，谢谢大家。
Thank you, President Xi Jinping. This is the end of the press conference. Thank you all for coming.
Well, that was the live feed of Chinese President Xi Jinping's speech, and he concludes this year's G20 summit with a leaders' communique which set the course for the world economy. And I want to thank our studio guests here, Mr. Liu Fa and Mr. John Russell. We wish we could have more discussion, but we're going to have to leave you there for now. And stay tuned on CCTV News on Asia Today and China 24 for more discussions. I'm Wang Mengmang. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.